Picture this. Autumn of 333 BCE, the Mediterranean coastline near a small town called Issus, where the mountains crash almost directly into the sea, leaving only a narrow strip of land between them. On one side stands Alexander, fresh off his victory at the Granicus, leading a battle-hardened army of roughly 40,000 men deep into enemy territory. On the other side, for the first time, stands the man himself. Not a satrap, not a merry general, king of kings. Darius III has come to the field in person, and he has not come alone. Nobody on that beach that morning could have imagined that by nightfall, the most powerful man in the known world would be fleeing in an abandoned chariot, leaving his own mother, wife, and children behind in the hands of his enemy. This is the story of the Battle of Issus, the day Alexander proved that Granicus was no accident, and the day an empire learned that numbers cannot save a king who breaks and runs. To understand how this moment came to be, you have to follow Alexander's movements in the months after Granicus. His victory on that riverbank had opened the gates of Asia Minor, city after city surrendering without resistance. But Alexander had no intention of stopping there. He pushed south along the coast, capturing key ports and cutting off the Persian navy's ability to strike behind his lines. It was methodical, patient, nothing like the reckless charge some assumed defined him. He was dismantling an empire piece by piece, one harbor at a time. Word of this advance eventually reached Darius, sitting on a throne far to the east, listening to report after report of cities falling to a king barely in his 20s. This was no longer a problem for local governors to handle. So Darius made a decision that would define the rest of his reign. He would come himself and end personally. But Alexander had no idea just how enormous the answer to that decision would be, or how badly it would nearly work against him. Because when Darius mobilized, he did not send an army. He emptied a continent. Men marched in from every province of the empire, gathering into a single mass so large that even the soldiers within it could not see where it ended. And here is the part that should have terrified Alexander more than anything he had faced so far. Darius had learned from Granicus. This time there was no council of overconfident satraps arguing among themselves. This time there was only one voice giving orders, and that voice commanded more soldiers than Alexander had ever seen assembled in one place in his entire life. For a moment, imagine standing in Alexander's position, receiving the scouting reports. Not just outnumbered by a margin that made the odds at Granicus look almost fair by comparison. Any rational commander studies those numbers and looks for a way to avoid the fight entirely. And then came the twist nobody, not even Alexander, saw coming. Darius made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and it had nothing to do with courage or cowardice. It was a simple, catastrophic error of geography. Rather than waiting on open ground, where his overwhelming numbers could spread out and surround the smaller Macedonian force like a fist closing around a coin, Darius marched his massive army into a narrow coastal strip near the town of Issus, a corridor squeezed between steep mountains and the sea, barely wide enough for a fraction of his troops to fight at once. Historians still argue over why. Some think he was trying to cut off Alexander's supply lines and trap him from behind. Others believe the sheer size of his own force blinded him to how useless that size would become the moment it was forced to fight in a bottleneck. Whatever the reason, the decision had already been made, and it could not be undone. When Alexander's scouts confirmed the news that the Persian army had swung around behind him and now blocked the narrow road home, his reaction was not panic. It was something closer to disbelief, followed almost immediately by opportunity. The trap Darius thought he had built for Alexander had actually become a trap Darius had built for himself. In open country, that army would have swallowed the Macedonians whole within an hour. In this corridor, most of those soldiers would never even reach the fighting, stacked uselessly behind their own front lines while a battle decided the fate of an empire just a few hundred meters ahead of them. Alexander turned his army around and marched back toward Issus. And as both sides began arranging into position along the narrow plain, everyone present understood, without needing to be told, that this would be the largest confrontation either side had ever staked their lives on. The Granicus River cut through the battlefield, shallow but steep-banked in places, and Darius positioned his forces along the far side, anchoring his center around his own position, surrounded by his finest infantry and cavalry. It was less a battle line than a human fortress built around one man. Alexander studied that formation from across the water and noticed something crucial. If his right flank, the flank he personally commanded, could punch through fast enough, there was a real path cutting straight toward the king himself. It was an enormous gamble. If his cavalry got bogged down in that dense wall of soldiers, there would be no retreat, no second chance, nothing but the river at their backs. He decided to take the gamble anyway. The horns sounded, and the field erupted. Persian archers unleashed volleys that darkened the sky above the narrow plain, arrows falling in waves as Macedonian shields snapped up in unison to catch them. On the coastal flank, Persian cavalry pressed hard against the smaller Greek units stationed there, and for several tense minutes, the entire left side of Alexander's line looked dangerously close to buckling, shouts and screams rolling across the water as men at arm's length in the crush. But on the right, exactly where Alexander had planned, something extraordinary was building. He led the companion cavalry across the river in a driving wedge formation, horses crashing through the shallows, and slammed into the Persian left flank before it could properly brace. The sound alone must have been staggering, shields splintering, spear shafts snapping, the screaming of horses and men tangled together in the chaos of first contact. Dust rose in thick clouds off the dry ground behind the riverbank, mixing with the spray kicked up from the water, until soldiers on both sides could barely tell friend from enemy in the haze. And through all of it, Alexander did not stop to consolidate his gains or secure the flank he had just broken. He turned his cavalry inward, cutting a deliberate path through the collapsing Persian line, aimed at one target and one target only. No one on that field expected what happened next. As Alexander's wedge tore closer, soldier by soldier, yard by bloody yard, panic began to spread through the ranks surrounding the royal chariot. This was not simply another enemy commander pressing an advantage. This was the same young king who had reportedly taken a skull at Granicus and walked away breathing, now cutting through a wall of soldiers many times the size of his own escort, and he was coming directly for the throne. Darius watched it happen from his elevated position, close enough now to see individual faces in the crush. Ancient sources describe his own charioteer being cut down nearby, the horses beside him rearing in terror, the entire royal guard beginning to fracture under the pressure. And in that moment, something inside the King of Kings broke. He turned his chariot around and fled the battlefield. Sit for a second. The ruler of the largest realm on earth, a man whose word could move armies from the Aegean to the Himalayas, abandoned his own soldiers in the middle of the most important battle of his life and ran. He reportedly abandoned the chariot itself partway through his escape, switching to a horse, simply to move faster over the rough ground, discarding his royal bow, his shield, even his cloak, items Alexander's men would later find scattered across the field like breadcrumbs marking the exact route of his flight. And this is where the story stops being simply a battle and becomes something closer to a tragedy. Because Darius did not flee alone in the sense that mattered. Traveling with the royal court, as was custom for a campaign of this significance, were his mother, his wife, and his young children, kept in the royal camp behind the lines, guarded by soldiers who were supposed to be utterly, unquestionably safe given the scale of the army protecting them. When that army collapsed, so did their protection. What do you imagine went through their minds in the hours that followed, as word spread that the king had fled and the camp had fallen into Macedonian hands? They had every reason to expect the worst. Ancient armies did not have a reputation for mercy toward a defeated enemy's family. Humiliation, slavery, perhaps worse. There was no reason for them to expect anything else from the young conqueror, whose army had just shattered their protector's forces in a single afternoon. Alexander did the opposite. Once word of Darius's flight reached the rest of the Persian army, the effect was immediate and total. A force so massive it had taken days just to march into position dissolved into chaos within minutes. Soldiers who had never even reached the actual fighting, packed helplessly behind their own front lines in that narrow corridor, began trampling each other in the desperate scramble to escape a battle most of them had never fired a single arrow in. The slaughter that followed was immense. Trapped between mountains and sea with nowhere to retreat in order, thousands of Persian soldiers were cut down as they fled, the very terrain Darius had chosen to trap Alexander becoming, instead, a killing ground for his own collapsing ranks. Ancient estimates run extraordinarily high, some claiming tens of thousands lost in the rout, though modern historians treat the most extreme figures with caution. What remains beyond dispute is the lopsided cost on Alexander's side, his own dead numbering only in the hundreds, a pattern that was quickly becoming his signature. When Macedonian soldiers finally reached the royal camp, they found Darius's mother Sysigambis, his wife Statera, and his children waiting, having heard the fighting draw closer and closer with no way to flee themselves. They braced for exactly the treatment they had every historical reason to expect. Alexander ordered exactly the opposite. Full dignity, full royal, preserved, guards posted not to control them, but to protect them. This was not mercy. It was one of the most brilliant political maneuvers of his entire career. By treating the royal family with honor instead of cruelty, Alexander sent a message racing across the empire faster than any army could march, that he was not simply a destroyer, but potentially something far more dangerous to Persian resistance, a ruler worth surrendering to rather than dying to oppose. Darius, safe but stripped of his army, his treasury, and his own family in a single catastrophic afternoon, sent envoys in the following months, offering enormous ransoms and territory for their return. Alexander refused every single offer, understanding that he now held something worth more than gold. He held proof, witnessed by an entire empire, that the King of Kings would run rather than die fighting. The numbers from that single day remain almost impossible to believe side by side. A Persian host so vast that ancient writers could not even agree on its size was broken by a force a fraction as large, in a battle that lasted only hours from first arrow to final rout. And this was only step. One final confrontation, bigger than anything either side had yet thrown into the field, was still waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, a last stand that would decide the empire's fate for good. But Issus had already proven something Granicus alone could not. Alexander was not a young man who had gotten lucky once against a handful of quarreling satraps. He could stand against the very heart of Persian power, against the emperor himself, and not only survive, but shatter that power so completely that its ruler chose to abandon his own family rather than face him. It was the day the King of Kings discovered his crown could not protect him from a 23-year-old who had already once walked away from a blade meant to end him. And it was the day the Persian Empire understood, whether it wanted to admit it or not, that its world was already beginning to end.